Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you may be. Welcome to Talk to East Turkestan, another live show for you today. Today we have a very special guest for you. Joining us all the way from the United States, we have Dr. General Robert Spalding. Robert Spalding is a national security policy strategist, globally recognized for his knowledge of China's economic competition and influence. He has served in senior positions of strategy and diplomacy within the defense and state departments for more than 26 years. Retiring as a general, he was the chief architect for the Trump administration's widely praised National Security Strategy, NSS, and the senior director for strategy to the president at the National Security Council. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome General Robert Spalding to our show today. Welcome, General. It's 8 a.m. over there. Good morning to you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It truly is an honor for me, the team at Talk to East Turkestan, to have you on our show. I don't want to go through your CV. Your CV speaks for itself. You're very well known. I basically want to start off, before we get into the gist of things, your relationship with China. How did it start? And how do we get to you today talking about China and US relations and what some people detail or calling this period in time as Cold War Part 2 between the US and China?
Well, I first went to China in 2002. That was after spending a year at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, where I learned Chinese after studying for a year. We went to Shanghai, where I studied at Tongji University, myself and my wife and two boys, and lived in China for 2 years while I studied at Tongji, and traveled all over China. Really got to know the language, the culture, the people, the geography of China, and really had a wonderful time. Most of at the time, China was growing really fast because it had just entered the WTO. Many new companies were building factories there. So, I left China that first time with a sense of wonder and, really a desire to, I told my wife in 2004, I wanted to come back to China and live and start a business after I retired from the Air Force. After that, I went back to the Air Force, and over the years, I would be assigned China policy jobs when I had to do a staff job. So I spent time on the staff of the Office of Secretary of Defense, where I worked on the first U.S.-China archive agreement for access to PLA archives. So we were using it to look for missing from the Korean War. And then, the Air Force, at the end of my B-2 career, in flying, the Air Force decided to groom me to be the next Air Force defense attaché and senior defense official in Beijing. And so I started that group of assignments as a senior military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I spent a year in New York meeting with business and finance and other industry professionals. I went from there to be the advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, and then General Dumford. And then I went from there to be the senior defense official in Beijing. I spent only about 6 months that time in China because I was called to the White House at that time to help formulate the national security strategy.
Wow. Basically, I've called General Robert Spalding here today because of this book, Stealth War, How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. And what really caught my eye it wasn't until General Spalding pointed out certain things with regards to China, even calling China the biggest threat to the US, ahead of ISIS, ahead of Al-Qaeda, ahead of radical Islam or Putin. What was the feeling in the White House when you put this forward to your constituents? Did they support you? What was going on?
Well, it was very early in the Trump administration, and, we were trying to get a handle on what was going to be kind of the key elements of President Trump's strategy, what was going to be his foreign policy. And so there was a debate, in the National Security Council about what is the chief, environment, what are the key challenges that the United States faces. And I had just spent, 3 years working on U.S.-China competition in the Pentagon. So all about economics and finance and trade, much less about military, because, early on, I recognized that we weren't in a military competition as much as we were in economic competition. So we'd spent a lot of time studying the nature of the U.S.-China economic relationship and how that disadvantaged the United States from a national security perspective. And so my role with the National Security Council was to, in that debate, inform thinking with regard to how China had utilized openness, really globalization and the internet to, both, diminish the U.S. economic competitiveness, but also really create social turmoil in our country and really influence the international institutions that we were members of and the international community writ large.
It's really amazing because in the book, you're essentially outlining that you had to give tutorials or presentations. And I was amazed. I was like, this man, this general really had to educate the White House on the reality of China and how dangerous it was.
That's exactly right. In fact, there was, many times I would be told by some of my Commerce Department and Treasury Department counterparts that economic security and national security were not related. And I said, that's not correct. Economic security underpins national security because, at a minimum, your defense budget comes from your ability to generate tax revenue. But, more importantly, the industrial base, the social cohesion, the willingness of your society to embrace democratic principles, all that stems from the ability for the nation to meet the needs of the population. And essentially, this is the area that had been attacked by the Chinese, and it's not just the United States, it's democracies everywhere. Just this erosion of economic competitiveness of the industrial base, of manufacturing in the United States, the consequent loss of millions of jobs. All of these things took a toll on, tens of thousands of small communities within the United States that had resulted in, a rise in really not an appreciation of democracy, because, many were beginning to question, including not just, the working class, but also many of the elites were beginning to question the value of democracy because, China's economy had been growing for 3 decades. So, it was really explaining the tie between this mercantilist, predatory economic behavior on the part of China and this and decline in prosperity and liberty in the United States and other democracies around the world.
The same in my country, in Australia. The politics really, the CCP has seeped into our political system, whether it be bribes given to certain MPs or what we call MPs in Australia, it would be like senators in the US. We've really seen some cases put forward. How much of an influence today does China have in American politics?
Oh, it's incredible. Much of it stems from the flow of capital. And, there's a good book by Clive Hamilton talking about the influence of the Chinese Communist Party into Wall Street, particularly with the introduction of princelings, Chinese Communist Party princelings that have been working at companies like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, just so that those companies can gain business in China. And then, of course, as you know, the Wall Street has a big influence over the political process in Washington, D.C., both in the administration and on Capitol Hill. And so there's a cycle of financial incentives that, our investment community, our banking community, our corporate community receives, and therefore they're incentivized then to promote policies that go along with what the Chinese Communist Party does. And so, the Trump administration basically implemented a number of policy changes, but that was in spite of terrific political pressure placed on the administration from Wall Street, from corporate America, to continue to support their relationships with the Chinese Communist Party. So it's a very insidious and in many ways incestuous relationship with the Chinese Communist Party that ends up, with the large institutions that are supposed to guard our democracy actually eroding our democracy, because many of those leaders in those institutions are paid, wonderful sums to continue to perpetuate this relationship.
It's amazing how. Sorry. It's just amazing the level that it got to. I've read an article here where it says China manufactures parts for F-35 fighter jets, which is used by the UK and the US. How did it get to this level? I mean, in the book, you literally say we were drunk on China's money, on capital, on their power. I mean, how did it get to that level? Was it purely money?
Well, yes, because what you look at and particularly in manufacturing, what we did in the United States over the course of many decades is introduce labor laws and introduce, of course, you had labor unions, and introduce environmental controls to ensure that we weren't exploiting people and polluting our environment. All of those added cost to the manufacturing process. And so, the key thing that China offered these companies that were making products was they could do the manufacturing in China, but there was no unions, there was no labor laws to speak of, there was no environmental controls, and so you could have very, very high margins on the basis of that fact. So, a company like Apple could gain, cash reserves in the order of $260 billion by offshoring manufacturing to China. And so everybody wanted to do that because everybody wanted high margins. I remember helping, a friend negotiate a price for sunglasses in China when I was living there. And, these were sunglasses that were going to be sold in the United States. And I think the selling price was $10 US. The cost that was quoted to this businessman in the course of this negotiations was essentially the equivalent of 25 cents a pair. So that's huge margins. And so this enormous profitability that these companies were able to attain by eschewing production quality, but also, labor laws and environmental laws just meant that so many would be incentivized to continue this relationship. And so what you had over the course of 2 decades in the United States is a wholesale destruction of factories, over 70,000 factories, 5 million manufacturing jobs. And as economists know, each manufacturing job comes with it an equivalent 4 jobs in the community that support that manufacturer. And so you're talking about 20 million jobs overall. And these were jobs that had, employment benefits or medical benefits and retirement benefits, all those went away. And so you have all of these communities throughout the United States that had lost their major employer in that community. And so this increased the pressure on government to provide unemployment, to provide medical benefits and social security benefits, in spite of the fact that people weren't working. This ends up, if you go out several decades, destroying the society, and that's essentially what's been going on. And so, as I say in the book, it's no surprise that the American people were looking for something different, and that's why you saw the rise of President Trump and in the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, because people were just tired of the establishment who had done nothing but essentially allow their lives to be destroyed.
Do you believe that your actions towards China, or your thoughts, or your policy, or the policies that you wanted to put forward, do you think that's how you ended up leaving your position at the NSC?
Well, ultimately, after the national security strategy was kind of in hand and had a proper structure, I really started focusing on 5G because I was particularly concerned about the rise of China's power within tech, within data collection and artificial intelligence. And so, I did a study on 5G. And of course, that study was leaked to the media because the telecom industry, who by the way, had been nearly destroyed in terms of the network equipment providers, essentially saw, a more of a government role in protecting the citizens' data and information and privacy as a potential threat to their monopoly or oligopoly in telecom. So they had it, somebody within the government leaked a paper, and then within a week I had left the administration. So it wasn't necessarily directly related to China or the Chinese Communist Party, but in a way it was related because it is the role of the Chinese Communist Party to destroy the telecom industry globally, so that in the end, the only suppliers for equipment are Chinese companies. Because when that happens, their ability to collect data all over the world will be unopposed. And the reason they want to collect data is because, as Kai-Fu Lee says, they want to become the Saudi Arabia of data, because they know that data drives artificial intelligence, which drives economic benefits for China, but also allows them to surveil and influence populations around the world.
It's amazing. In your book, you're spot on where you say the days of bombs and bullets used in wars are over. We've moved on, as you've mentioned, data collecting, technology, economics. These are the new weapons in this war. And essentially, we are now seeing what many are describing as Cold War II between the US and China. Would you describe it that way, or do you have another name for it?
No, I think it's definitely a Cold War, and that's distinguished between a hot war, which I don't think is going to happen because both nations have nuclear weapons. It would be far too risky and destructive to go into a hot war. So I definitely think it's a Cold War, and the reason it's more about ones and zeros and dollars and cents is because if you look at the history of modern warfare, it's really about protecting your population from coercion or undue influence from outside adversaries. Now, we built armies and navies and air forces to protect from an invasion and a conquering that would allow for that. And in its place, we built these economic and informational connections that actually allowed countries like the Chinese Communist Party-led China and Russia and others to bypass the military altogether and go directly to the citizens. through social media, through these e-commerce. So, apps like TikTok, companies like Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Huawei is not the main problem. Huawei is basically an enabler for the large tech companies in China to acquire data and then harvest it for their own means.
I want to get to our page for Talk to East Turkestan. I'm going to get to the Uyghurs in a minute. We have many people commenting on that. But could you just touch upon 5G a bit more? Many people actually don't know what 5G is, the influence or the national security risks that could happen to countries like the United States, Australia, Canada, many others. And talks of China pushing through 5G this year, next year, whereas quote unquote Western countries are probably 4 or 5 years going to be late. How's that going to impact on national security or just 5G in general?
Well, first of all, it's going to lead to a massive collection of data, far more than we currently collect on individuals. So, what true 5G is, it's not just a pipe, a data pipe like 4G, a connection for your smartphone. It's actually also a computing platform. Wow. So, in a smart city, you'll see cameras and other machines that are connected to the 5G network. These cameras will have facial recognition algorithms that run in the network. And so you'll have real-time identification of people as they move around the city and the ability to track them and everything they do. So, as this information is used for things other than, just enabling you to get an Uber or do virtual button pushes so that you can just make gestures and say what you want, this data can also be used to influence you. And that's exactly what the Chinese Communist Party is building. So when I was there in 2017 as a defense attaché, I got a smartphone and I had all the apps put on it because I wanted to understand what it was to live as a digital citizen in China. And the ability for them to collect data and track you is incredible. You could order, and this was 2017, you could order food from a restaurant on your smartphone, walk into the restaurant and never touch your phone again because a camera would, recognize your face and then the server would greet you by name and hand you your food. So they were already starting to build elements of 5G into the society in 2017. Now, as the networks are rolling out, they're able to, do that. And so not only are there cameras everywhere in the cities, but, the police have cameras that they can readily identify people through AR or AR goggles. So it's an incredible, it really transforms your life from one of, where it's primarily human-centered activity to much more human machine and machine-to-machine interaction. All of this data collected on you, though, is used in China with social credit scores. So, you get you jaywalk, you smoke, you drink, you gamble, you curse the government. All of this, causes a decline in your social credit. And if it goes down far enough, you don't get, you can't travel, you don't get services. Maybe your kid doesn't get into college. So this is what China is building within China. But as you see the rise of Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent in the global economy, the global e-economy, then their ability to introduce the same kind of policies with regard to, how citizens have access to services is going to increase. If they invest in your transportation system, if they invest in your telecommunication system, your access to those services may be hindered by the fact that, you've done something that's angered the Chinese Communist Party. So what it's done is allow them, through the introduction of, this kind of modern economic system, to, bypass many of the protections that a government might have in place to prevent the undue influence by an outside country.
On Twitter, I've seen that you've tweeted about the Uyghurs. I'm actually going to get into that because that's what we're all about. I wanted your view on certain things. Clearly, you are aware of the issue. What is your stance on whether it be American politicians or Western politicians or American companies or Western companies that are directly or indirectly involved in China's concentration camps where they've locked up millions of Uyghur Muslims?
Well, I mean, it's just part and parcel to what I was saying about, you know, the exploitation of people and the lack of environmental controls. It's just one other example of how the Chinese Communist Party is this very, very, you know, damaging regime that is willing to do almost anything. In the case of the Uyghurs, you know, this really happens to be Xi Jinping's, you know, his way of demonstrating his strength, you know, and kind of was tied to, I believe, his rise as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. You know, much like Jiang Zemin is known for, you know, his order to exterminate the Falun Gong. It is part of Chinese Communist Party politics, and unfortunately, you know, when you deal with the Chinese Communist Party, you realize that there's really no concern for morals or life or anything like that. It's really about only about the preservation and prerogative of the Chinese Communist Party. And so, you know, but what they do because of the globalized internet connected world is that, you know, it's not limited to the Chinese Communist Party. It's companies like Nike, you know, it's companies like Microsoft that support the regime by continuing to, you know, garner trade with them. I mean, that's the problem with our system. You know, a company has only to, you know, respond to a request for fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders. It has no corporate responsibility to, you know, prevent genocide, which is essentially what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. And you would think, well, that's horrible. You know, with all the social justice that U.S. corporations claim to promote today, but it's only social justice in when it makes sense from a marketing perspective. You know, they really don't have anything that forces them to comply with human rights. And in fact, the international order was developed to promote democratic principles and human rights. But what we've seen, and this is where it goes back to the beginning days of the Trump administration, the decline in the United States and other democracies to promote those principles in international institutions is part and parcel to globalization and the internet. As you know, China has gathered strength and it has gathered adherence to its blend of economics and politics. It really is not about, you know, making people's lives better. It's really just promoting the continued power of the Chinese Communist Party.
You've just said something really interesting. While at the same time, you know, we call on companies or we tell people to boycott such and such company because they're directly or indirectly involved in such atrocities. But at the same time, you're telling me that, for example, the American government system has it where these companies, as you mentioned, have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to do everything they can to profit. So who should we be going for? Should we be naming and shaming these companies, or should we be going to the source and telling governments to change their policies and laws? Or should these companies, out of their own heart, go and approach these companies? Because it doesn't seem responsible, you know, to carry out these acts to boycott. But at the same time, it's against the law for them to stop dealings with the CCP, from what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. You have to implement policies that that create an incentive for companies to do the right thing, first of all, companies have to make a profit. That's how the free market economy works. But they have to make a profit in ways that support the founding principles of, in our case, of the United States. And we have had is we had a number of policies, particularly in the case of China, where we said we are going to provide for China's economic growth and prosperity because we believe that eventually it will lead to a democratization in China. And the Chinese Communist Party just took the innovation, technology, talent, and capital and made themselves stronger and actually reverse engineered the system to promote authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And so in many ways, corporate America and Wall Street thought, hey, not only are we getting rich, but we're making the world safe for democracy because we're promoting openness. But that openness had been hijacked. And so when you think about it from in our system, and this is what I tell to congressional leaders, is that it's the government's responsibility to set the rules for how business is conducted. And then business will go out and figure out a way to do that. Now, in the case of our relationship with China, which happens to be the single most damaging factor in the decline of, our promotion of democratic principles and human rights, we have to recognize what they're doing, which is really undermining and then eventually co-opting companies, because that's the only way they can survive. It's the only way that Apple can survive if they, essentially seek a haven within China, and therefore they have to do it the way the Chinese Communist Party wants. And so the only way to really get things under control is to begin to incentivize the companies not to be in China. And the way you do that, one of the major ways is tariffs, because China doesn't have a market economy. So you have to institute tariffs, and they really have to be permanent, because the whole idea of China entering the WTO was it would become a market economy, not a market economy. It's never going to be a market economy. In addition, things like the closed financial system, you have to cut off their access to the dollar because they don't have a convertible currency. They're the only country in the world that doesn't have a convertible currency, other than maybe like North Korea. I mean, no modern nation that, particularly a number 2 economy, has a non-convertible currency and strict capital controls, and yet is still allowed to be in the international financial system. This allows them to take that, what I just talked about, that uneven trade balance, and then that offsetting currency trade that's supposed to make things go back to the level, they just can continue it perpetually because they have a closed financial system. So they've engineered their economy, their financial system, to be immune to the kind of market effects that all other nations that are part of the global community around the world. So this is why you have a running currency in Brazil, because they have a freely traded currency. So it forces the government to actually make good policies. In the case of China, they've insulated themselves, the Chinese Communist Party has, from this activity. So then you have to implement policies that say, okay, China doesn't have a market economy. They have a closed financial system. And today, because of Hong Kong, they have 2 central banks. No nation is allowed to have 2 central banks. So all of these things, it requires the United States to implement policies that begin to put pressure on the regime to change. That's what's been happening since approximately the first quarter of 2018. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, hates it.
Our channel here, the Uyghurs are predominantly a Muslim population, around 99%. And obviously, a lot of our work, besides talking to the likes of yourself, Western democracies, we also try and get through to Muslim majority countries. But unfortunately, it's falling on deaf ears, especially on July 1, 2020 in Geneva, during the 44th session of the UN Human Rights Council. There were 46 countries that supported China's policies attacking Uyghurs. And what was shocking was you had many of these countries, for example, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, even Palestine, support China. What do you say to these countries, or what would your message be to these countries? That's that are essentially taking where China is implementing a genocide on technically their fellow Muslim brothers and sisters. Because what's really crazy is we've got the USA really leading the way with the recent Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. What would your message be to them?
Well, I mean, I think it's what I found and what I say in my book is, quite frankly, what the Chinese Communist Party stumbled on was just a brilliant strategy, and that is to ensure that, around the world, if you're doing business, then, the way that you want to do it is in ways that benefit the Chinese Communist Party. It's tying your financial interests with their national interests. It's really brilliant if you think about it, because there's two things that motivate people in the world. It's greed and fear. If you think about the Soviet Union, they were far more into the fear aspect of motivation. In other words, they were going to roll tanks, like in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. They were going to take control and they're going to kill people. Well, the Chinese do that to their own population, but everybody else, and in a lot of ways with the elites in their population, their main motivation is greed. If they can appeal to greed, then they don't have to use weapons. They don't have to use, bullying tactics. They can basically pay you off. And that's what they've done. And they've done it quite well. It just so happens that when you look at their system, their Marxist system with Chinese characteristics, the Chinese characteristics are really have been around for a long time. It's how you use subterfuge and payments to get your adversaries to fight among themselves. It's really Sun Tzu, Art of War, the Three Kingdoms period. If you study China, you realize that for the most part, it's not when it comes to dealing with outside adversaries, it's more about co-opting them than it is to going to war with them, because war is really risky. That's their calculus. So I think it's a really a good strategy. Unfortunately, when so many companies are making so much money, both in the banking centers and in the corporate sector, then both the banking sector and the corporate sector donate money to political campaigns. And so the political process becomes corrupted. And then, of course, you have the Chinese Communist Party whispering in their ear. So it is I believe it's a very corrupt system currently in the international order and in the many democracies with regard to this relationship between banking sector, corporate sector, and the Chinese Communist Party.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say, well, one thing, one belt, one road, or whether it be China's technology. I'm going to play devil's advocate and say, well, if the United States had come up with these sort of ideas, the technology, I mean, I've even seen a hotel that they've set up where robots run the show. There are no staff. Is the United States just jealous of China? Because this technology looks really nice, doesn't it? It looks like it's helping lives. What do you say to those?
Well, so what as I say in the book, I really applaud what the Chinese have done using development, economic development really to drive their strategy, because in a lot of ways they're answering people's needs. In Africa, the biggest investment in 2017 was in low value added manufacturing. And that's because they'd already put in kind of all the telecommunications, power, water, rail, roads that needed to extract resources, raw materials from Africa. And then they started investing in manufacturing, now housing, and pretty soon they're selling smartphones and allowing them to do electronic payments, moving into an information economy. So this is their strategy of how they co-opt the leaders of these countries and go from unindustrialized countries, really developing economies, to information economies, really in a generation or two. So I think it is a good way of doing things. Now, when you say could the United States be jealous? Well, I don't know if we're jealous or just you know, as Mark Twain would say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So if you look at the United States efforts in the Marshall Fund, for example, or in Japan and Korea post World War II, we've done incredible job in both developing economies, but also helping grow institutions that allow for the rise of rule of law and civil society. What happened was after the end of the Cold War, we just stopped. We said, we won. Okay, everybody just, business will, do the rest. We'll finish it off. No, it's not going to finish it off. Apple, IBM, General Motors have no incentives to go and help drive, institutions in developing economies. They just want to make money any way they can. And it's not up to them to drive principles of civil liberty. So, this is something where we started working in the Trump administration to kind of revitalize how we think of economic development more strategically. It's still not done. I still think the Chinese Communist Party intends to use Belt and Road Initiative to capture many developing economies because they need that kind of economic growth. And they do so because, the United States has left a vacuum. I advocate that the United States needs to be builders, not breakers. We're really good at going to war. We really need to be good at helping countries develop economically, but also institutions that rise up that promote rule of law and civil liberties.
The implementation of Confucius Institutes in the US, in Australia, I had the pleasure about a month ago in interviewing Drew Pavlo. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, where he is on the verge of expulsion from his university in Queensland. Have you heard of him? I'm sure I've interviewed him.
Yes.
And basically, he's taken it to the Supreme Court in Australia. Basically, the deans of universities taking massive bribes, being invited to China, being spurred upon, 5-star hotels. Many would argue, so what? The United States, delivers its soft power through its movies, through other means. Why can't China do the same? What's the difference between Chinese soft power and the US's soft power?
Well, the National Endowment for Democracy actually put out a report called Shark Power. So I think that's a better term for it. It's actually the Confucius Institutes worked for the propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party. It is essentially propagandizing both the administration of these universities and the student body. It's about spreading Marxism throughout the world. So it's not kind of leading with the quality of your society. Is trying to convince through graft and payments, the university system, because what happens? Your elites come out of the university system. So if you can convert elites to Marxism as they're going through the university system, they come out. They are much easier to kind of get them in line. If you can get them to repeat kind of your talking points, if you can control the narrative, if you can win them over, as they're growing through these formative years, then it gives you an advantage, and that's what they're doing. And of course, when Xi Jinping came in, they started, increasing the support for these programs by on the order of billions of dollars. So really trying to promote propagandizing and controlling the narrative all over the world, which includes Confucius Institutes, but also, has legacy media like CGTN. Of course, they use WeChat and TikTok and purchase shares in other social media platforms, or otherwise get them to censor speech. So it's really about spreading the Chinese Communist Party narrative around the world. So it's not soft power in so much as it's sharp power. Soft power, the Joseph Nye would kind of coin the term. It's really about the attractiveness of your society based on the principles that it's founded on. Now, nobody would say that the Chinese Communist Party led China is attractive. Hardly anybody wants to move to China. Nobody wants to become a Chinese citizen. This is therefore not soft power. It's really sharp power.
Now, we do see a shift in American universities. I mean, here's an article here back in April this year where MIT have cut ties with a technology company called iFlyTech because they aid in the oppression of Uyghurs. Essentially, they surveil them, they monitor the activities, and based on that, they are put into concentration camps. Is this shift continuing, or is this just solely of a few universities like MIT?
It is continuing. The big problem that we have is that most people don't understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party regime. Most China experts are incentivized to essentially help the Chinese communists spread their narrative because they want to have access to visas to be able to travel to China to do research. And to the extent that they don't follow the Chinese Communist Party narrative, they're often denied visas. And so, my goal and job, and the reason I left the Air Force prematurely, was because I wanted to be able to spread this awareness of the Chinese Communist Party. Because once people understand what the regime is doing, once they understand the implications of their retirement funds going to China and of them buying Chinese goods, they tend to respond in an appropriate manner, and that is to want to cut off that kind of behavior. But until that is exposed, they may be be concerned about the Uyghurs, but more importantly, they're concerned about their own lives. They're concerned about having a job, raising a family. And most people in a society like America are, quite frankly, self-centered. And so you have to appeal to how, it affects their lives. And then they begin to see, okay, well, it's not only affecting the lives of the Uyghurs and the Chinese people or the Tibetans or the people of Hong Kong or the Falun Gong or the Christians, it's affecting me too. And so, then it becomes something that's tangible and something that they're willing to go to the polls about.
What you just raised was very good, because I mentioned this many times, saying, look, if we don't stop China now, this oppression that the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Chinese Christians, Chinese Democrats, Falun Gong are going through are going to reach your doorstep. And, President Trump has mentioned that the coronavirus attack, or I love him calling it the CCP plague, is worse than Pearl Harbor or 9/11. And this was not just, say, quote unquote, attack on the US, but the whole world has felt this. Would you agree with the description of President Trump in this regard?
Well, yeah. So I've said quite often that by Xi Jinping's own, statement, he was in charge of Wuhan on the 7th of January. Between the 7th of January and the 23rd of January, when they closed down Wuhan, millions of people traveled from Wuhan, many to international destinations. At the same time, the Chinese government was locking down PPE and masks in China and then getting proxies around the world to buy it up so that they could profit from it. So this is going on while Xi Jinping himself says that he's in charge of Wuhan. So the only conclusion that you can come to is that the Chinese Communist Party deliberately spread the pandemic, enabled its spread in order to profit, or at a minimum to ensure that it wasn't the only economy that was dealing with it. If you think about it, if your economy is going to take a hit, and you think like the Chinese Communist Party, and that is the world is zero sum, then if I'm going to take a hit, I want all of my everybody else to take a hit. That way, we all suffer together. But more importantly, because we're all going to take a hit, and the thing that we're going to need are PPE and masks. Not only can we take a hit, but we can end up profiting from it while everybody else is down. And so that's what they did. And it's clear that they put pressure on the WHO to deny human-to-human transmission. they still have not, formally notified the WHO that they had an outbreak in China. So, I mean, it is clear that they essentially committed biological warfare on the entire world. And the funny thing is, they were then using the influence machine to try to convince the world that it did come from China, it came from the U.S. The latest is that it came from Spain. So it's just incredible. And if you read Unrestricted Warfare on page, I think 145, it talks about combining things like biological warfare and media warfare and political warfare to create new forms of warfare. And so they've essentially done that and been very successful at it.
Your forecast about China for the West and for the Western world, and perhaps even for the world, has come true in essence so far. Where do you see us in a post-pandemic world? Do you see business go back to normal after this pandemic ends? Or is this Cold War going to continue? And do you see countries ally with US in its stance against China?
So what we have in the United States, and this is the same thing that's going on in other democracies, is a war, a domestic war between those that essentially want to preserve the status quo and those that want to change it. And, in the United States and in other democracies, the working class has risen up and said, we want something different. Now, it remains to be seen, whether that, with the introduction of the coronavirus, I actually think that was very smart on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party to do what they've done, because here in the United States, they've created this narrative that, the election in 2020 is not about the Chinese Communist Party, it's about the coronavirus. And so, but, the ones that are on the side of, protecting the country from the coronavirus are also kind of the establishment people. So, the Trump administration has done a terrible job with regard to the coronavirus, never mind that it was actually spread by the Chinese Communist Party, but we'll do better. But when they get in office, then they want to go back to the same kind of trade policy with the Chinese Communist Party because they've been incentivized by it. I suspect the same thing is going on around the world. So I think 2020 is going to be a real telling year. Either we're going to see the continued march of democracy as we move into 2021, or we're going to see a setback. Ultimately, it will be democracy and democratic systems that are that turns the tide in this rising authoritarianism and really does in the Chinese Communist Party. If not, then I fear that we're in for an even worse future than the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was never going to be much of a power because it was essentially forced into bankruptcy, trying to compete with democracies. What the Chinese Communist Party has done is really embraced, democracies for their innovation, technology, talent, and capital, and we've allowed them to. And so, rather than competing with a closed regime, we're enabling a closed regime. So, as long as we keep doing that and we don't stop, which is what I'm hopeful for, we'll continue to do in 2021, we're going to be in big trouble.
I'm going to get in before we end the show. I do want to ask you this. We're going to get into some controversial waters. John Bolton's book and some of the remarks that President Trump had apparently made with regards to his support for the concentration camps. Do you have any comments on this?
Well, my view of looking at the Trump administration, I stopped a long time ago kind of listening to what the media was saying and what the narrative was. I started just looking at the policies. What are the policies that are being introduced? And, for the most part, I can see no fault with the policies. They're not implemented as fast as I would like, whether it be tariffs or sanctions against Chinese officials, but they are being implemented. And far more than any administration, Democrat or Republican prior, they have been putting in the policies one by one that really slow down the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, and I think are going to lead to the eventual reversal of the fortunes of the Chinese Communist Party. So, I wasn't there when he was supposedly talking to Xi and saying, hey, go get the Uyghurs. I think that's a great idea. Whatever the president is saying, in my mind, is designed for a purpose. It's a rhetorical purpose. It clearly doesn't represent. So he said, is reported frequently, best friends with Xi Jinping, my best buddy. But then he implements, hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs and, all these other sanctions against Chinese officials. I don't think Xi thinks he's his big buddy anymore. And in fact, the president's been saying, well, he's not too happy with Xi. So the whole media narrative thing is all about politics. I don't listen to it. I don't care for it. I really look at what are the policies coming out, and then how are other nations, our partner nations, reacting. I was in Europe last fall talking to, I was in Berlin and Brussels talking to German government, EU, NATO, and they all understand the challenge with regard to China now. They're getting on board. That doesn't come, from you. If you were listening to the media, you would think, they're all completely against President Trump. Not true. They're actually getting on board with regard to, for instance, they're all saying no Huawei. I would say the biggest problem right now is Germany, because they do sell a lot of their stuff to China. But for the most part, democracies are saying, hey, no more. We're not gonna be bound by Chinese Communist Party, influence anymore.
That's great that you mentioned the policies that are being put in place. What do you think of the recent policy that was turned into law, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act? Is this going to be what do you think the actual ramifications are going to be? I mean, I've seen Secretary Pompeo mention that that they've placed sanctions on for Chinese officials. Is this just going to be a piece of paper, or is this policy going to be tangible?
If you really want to cut off the Chinese Communist Party, you have to cut off their access to innovation, technology, talent, and capital. So anything that does that only on a limited basis is not going to be effective. You have to cut off the entire nation, because the Chinese Communist Party owns the banks, it owns the police force, it owns the borders, it owns the military. It basically controls everything in the society, and therefore, in order to essentially cut off the head of the snake, you have to cut off access to the entire country. That's the only way it's going to work. And, I've never been a fan of these, things that just go after individuals. You have to go after the entire system, because, the way the Chinese Communist Party looks at it, like, fine, you put somebody in jail. We've got 1.4 billion people. We're just going to keep going. You have to cut off the whole system. And so I think it's positive, but not enough. We really need to do things like making the tariffs permanent, stopping exchanging the Hong Kong dollar, because the Hong Kong no longer exists. Therefore, the Hong Kong dollar should not exist. China can't have two currencies. If it's going to be one country, one system, it's got to be one country, one currency. Can't have an extra currency just because they want an avenue to do IPOs for Chinese companies easily for, Western markets. This is what they're using Hong Kong for, and we ought to cut it off. These types of policies will really strangle the Chinese Communist Party. And when you strangle their economic growth, when you strangle their access to capital, innovation, technology, and talent, then you really prevent them from ultimately, in the end, you're going to prevent their ability to oppress their people.
Okay, last few questions. I want 1 or 2 word answers if you can. Xi Jinping, is he going to be overthrown within his own party?
No.
The CCP, the CCP itself, is that going to disband within the next 10 years?
Maybe.
Do you see the independence of Tibet, East Turkestan, Inner Mongolia in the next 10 years?
Maybe.
Maybe. And last question, you could kind of answer this. I always ask this to my strategist guests. We here at East Turkestan are a non-violent organization, and you've mentioned that this is a Cold War. It's not going to get into a hot war, even though China is committing a genocide. Now, 75, 76 years ago, America and its allies went into Germany, took down Hitler because of the genocide that it was committing against the Jews. Now, based on this, do you see in the future, 5-10 years down the track, the US allies any sort of military intervention into China to stop its genocidal policies?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you very much, General Robert Spalding. It was truly an honor for me and our channel. I hope to have you sometime in the future, hopefully talking about something more positive, but it looks like from what I'm hearing for you, we're going to be talking about China, CCP, and the evil that's coming from Xi Jinping for quite some time. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for everyone joining us. Please get a copy if you haven't got a copy of General Spalding's book. I honestly do believe that every country, every policymaker, every legislation maker should read a copy of this. It should be translated into every single language in the world. Get a copy of this on Amazon. Visit the website. He has written many other books, and follow him on Twitter. Thank you very much, sir. It's been truly an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.